John. $99 computers. Yeah. Yeah. Well, here he comes. Now we can start. Not a word, not a thing. I love you. Love you too. Hi, Mike. Hi, Kathy.
Kathy English. Kathy English.
Kathy,
Kathy English.
look who's here. All right. Well, let's get underway. Let's just take a moment and thank God for another day of life and for the gifts we have been given and for the kindness of people. I remember once we had a sister that was a Notre Dame sister who worked with all the sisters in the diocese, and I just told someone this story, and I had her one time for retreat, and I said to her, she said, I wish I loved people the way you do. And I said, I wish I loved God the way you do. Because the secret is to get them in balance. So thank you so much for your presence here and for everybody online. 99 computers joined us last week. And I know there's a Katie out there who's watching. Your grandparents are here, so. Aunt and uncle, I got it. So my youngest niece and her husband and daughter watched last week, so it's fun when you're watched, or maybe not. Last week, for those who were not able to be here, just a repeat of what we have up here of the Bible surrounded by two bookends. And we made use of that theme that Scripture is supported on both sides by first the context and culture out of which it came, and secondly, the context and culture on the other side. And it's very important to remember both because they have an impact on the word. Last week we talked about the transfiguration. Is there any comment anyone would like to make about last week's presentation or questions or insights? Everybody happy? Okay. The gospel for this Sunday is very, very familiar, the Samaritan woman. And we were she was kind enough to stop by, and Jeff's going to show her picture in the back. And I'd like to say to the staff, she needs a new hairdo. But it's symbolic and it's wonderful, and the water jugs are there. It's a long gospel, so what I plan to do is handle the bookend of the culture and context first, but read and then comment and see if you have anything. We'll do it a little bit differently. All right. First of all, let me give you a little background on John's Gospel, which I'm sure you know. Hi, Bob. It was written somewhere in the 90s. And during last week, I became aware that by the time John was writing his gospel, the church already had 4 popes. I was sort of stunned by that. I mean, 4 popes by the 90s. What he's dealing with now is a faith community quite organized, with an elected leader. Also, John writes in a style different from free. John does a great deal signs, symbols, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But today, the Samaritan woman story stands alone, but it also is a tremendous symbol for the church. And by the time John is writing, we now only have had 4 popes, but there are more Gentiles in the community than Jews. So the handsome man just wanted to be with me. Thank you. Okay. So by the year 100, there were more Gentiles in the community than Jews in the new faith. So that sets up a whole different context for the community. So what I'd like to do is put on my cheaters and read sections, short sections of the gospel, make a few comments, and see what you think. Now remember, we're on the bookend to your left. Right, excuse me. This is John 40, Gospel 4, chapter 4, and I'll start the first 5 verses. Now, when Jesus heard that the Pharisees had heard Jesus is making and baptizing more disciples than John, although it was not Jesus himself, but his disciples who were baptizing, he left Judea and started back to Galilee. But he had to go through Samaria, so he came to a Samaritan city near the plot of ground that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired out by his journey, was sitting by the well, and it was about noon. The critical thing, I believe, in the first part of this text is that he's in foreign territory. Whether he chose it or it was a necessity to go where he needed to go. So the question is, he's in Samaritan territory, and we need to ask ourselves, why were they so hated? The Samaritan territory is north of the country, but the critical piece is that the Samaritans and Jews had the same roots, the same ancestors. It reminded me of our Protestant brothers and sisters in the 16th century. They had the same roots as the Romans, but the split happened, and so there was, at many times, not only hatred, but war. But the Samaritans, for some reason, had a mixed heritage. Maybe there was intermarriage with their neighbors, whatever it might be. But they too were waiting for a Messiah. And they too had a temple. But they were considered heretics by the Jews. Now that sets the stage for this encounter, but also the weather set the stage. If you've ever been around the Mediterranean, it can get very warm. And the gospel writer tells us it was noon. Okay. Any comment about those first couple of verses? Makes you thirsty. Well, water is the big theme here, isn't it? All right, now let me go on and read and see what comes up. This is 7 through 12. A Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." His disciples had gone to the city to buy food, so they're out looking at McDonald's or something to get food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria?" Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans. John adds that little note. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have no bucket, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water?" There's a couple of interesting things about this text. She comes alone. He, a male, alone. Jesus starts a conversation with this stranger who's a woman. The woman already knew he was a Jew. How did she know that? Was it his appearance? Was it his accent? Was it the vocabulary he was using? But note, she says she's well aware we have similar roots here, because this is the well, Jacob's well. So that first part of the encounter is interesting. Any comment about that? Okay. Well, let's go on to 13 to 19. Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. But those who drink of the water that I will give them will never be thirsty. The water that I will give will become to them a spring gushing up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I may never be thirsty or have to keep coming here to draw water." Jesus said to her, "Go and call your husband and come back." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." And Jesus said to her, "You're right in saying, 'I have no husband,' for the one you have had 5, and the one you now have is not your husband. What you have said is true." Now, this is a stunning section. He is calling the woman to think more deeply. He's calling her to think more deeply about water by giving it the adjective living water. But like you and me, at times we need explanation of something that we don't understand or we misinterpret. We all do it. I might ask Liz about a court case, and she raises a question I never thought of, and I need some interpretation. I might need some interpretation about mammography machines and how they're checked by a physicist, and I don't know the terms. I need more interpretation. She realizes that when he says living water, there's something more here that she needs to question. So Jesus takes the lead and asks her to get her husband. And she responds, "I don't have one." And he says, "You're right." Now, for generations, we have interpreted her as possibly a very loose woman, maybe a prostitute, and maybe she was. Or maybe she was part of that old Jewish law, if your husband dies, you marry the brother, so you have kids. But there is another way to look at this five-husband question that some raise that I think is fascinating. Samaria had 5 male gods. And was Jesus saying to her, you're worshiping in the wrong place, and giving them the name of husband? What does that do to the story? Pam? It's a 180 in the story. It's a 180, completely changes your opinion. And hasn't that happened to us when we meet someone? Sometimes changes our whole worldview. The one you have is not your husband. And she said, I don't have one. Maybe trying to cover for herself. But that interpretation, I think, is fascinating. And it elevates her to a different position when we hear the gospel. It's like what the church has done to Mary Magdalene. We think of her as a sinner. I have a book that shows so many pictures of her. Redhead, loose outfit, sometimes no outfit. And in the 5th century, one of our popes settled the question what kind of a woman she was. And he gave a sermon and connected her to Mary of Bethany and to the woman who washed Jesus' feet, who was a sinner. So she got labeled in the 5th century, as a sinner. And that's been carried by her for all these years. We do that to people. And the Samaritan woman has carried that identifier for generations. Any comment? Larry?
I can't help but wonder if the Samaritan woman ends up being labeled so anathema because she was sassy with Jesus, right? This is not what a woman should be doing at the well with a man when she's there alone, let alone a man who's a foreigner. And she is, I'm really not loud enough.
No, they can't.
Okay, I got it. I wonder if she isn't labeled this way in part because she's so sassy with Jesus. She talks to him when she shouldn't talk to him. She challenges him. She says, you don't even have a bucket. I mean, if you think about women of that time frame, looking at a man at the well talking about getting water and he doesn't have a bucket, that becomes a statement of what is wrong with you, right?
Yeah.
And so some of it could be that she was just willing to buck every power dynamic of the day and time, that then we read her as someone who is untoward. And we're less likely to go looking for explanations like, was Jesus referring to the 5 gods of her people and referencing her 5 husbands?
Yep. Because we look superficially at the text. And thank God for people like a woman I'm going to share, Sandra Schneider's a sister who has written about John's gospel. And she raises this question. The theologians have dug a little bit deeper out into the Samaritan culture and history. But you and I coming up never heard that. Never. And it does, Pam, turn the thing 180. So when she says, I want to go call your husband, and we get down to a little bit further to verse 27, she says to him, Sir, I see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you say the place where people must worship is Jerusalem. Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me. The hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. That's a real cultural statement. Salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father seeks such as these to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and the truth. And the woman said to him, I know the Messiah is coming, who is called the Christ. When he comes, he will proclaim all things to us. And Jesus replied, I am he, the one who is speaking to you. This is a powerful discussion. A powerful discussion. And note the significance of the word, significance. I am he. Present tense. And what did John do throughout his gospel? Jesus said, I'm the light of the world. I am. I am the bread of life. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. He describes himself as I am he. I am the good shepherd. All present tense. And we can think about the Jewish scriptures and go back, and when Moses is on a mountain, says to the burning bush, who am I going to tell people you are? And God says, I am who am. Do you see the connection that the early church is making? But he has revealed to her such a profound statement. Can you imagine what she must have thought when she heard that? Just then the disciples came with their lunch, and they were astonished he was speaking to a woman. But no one said, what do you want, or why you are speaking to her? They knew better, but they were flabbergasted. Then the woman left her water jar and went back to the city and said to the people, come and see a man who told me everything I have ever done. Can he be the Messiah? They left the city and were on their way to him. She becomes a teacher. She becomes a preacher. She becomes a missionary, so impacted by this small conversation and the revelation, I am he. And the apostles are flabbergasted. They haven't heard the conversation, but they watched him talking with the woman. They had to be startled out of their minds. And then toward the end, many Samaritans from that city believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I've ever done. So when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with them. And he stayed 2 days. And many more believed because of his word. They said to the woman, it is no longer because of what you said for ourselves. And we know that this is truly the Savior of the world. There's so many things about this reading. Jesus has given her a key piece of information. And the readers of John's gospel began to understand that the message was going to be much broader than they thought. And their experience was, it's already happening. Like in the New York Times this morning, it shows Janet Yellen signing the new dollar bills as the Secretary of the Treasury. The first woman in over 200 years. Something good is happening. And this, his message was going to be broader than they thought. And his community was already experiencing it. But the key thing here that I never thought too much about, he stayed in that enemy, so to speak, territory 2 days. which meant they had to put him up and give him meals. And you wonder what the apostles thought. Good God, what are we doing? With a woman and with an enemy, so to speak. They had to be stunned because of this. She becomes a woman preacher with good results. And obviously, the disciples were impacted by this event. I often wonder what happened to the lunch. So just those few thoughts about the opening of this text. What do you have to say about that? John.
I think the writing is absolutely beautiful, how the gospel goes back and says salvation is through the Jews, but yet I am the light, and he's speaking to the Gentiles and to this whole new, world that the disciples are getting blown away by. So I just love that writing. The second thing I think is just so impactful is when you think water was the most precious item 2,000 years ago. And, but you would go to war over a well. And so this woman's by herself at the most precious resource. And so I think she is probably an outcast. But Jesus engages her and doesn't treat her, so she's an outcast of an enemy. And because of her interaction, or their interaction, she then goes back to her people so that believes something totally different, who's an outcast, and gets them to basically become disciples of Christ.
Beautiful. She becomes a bridge.
And lastly, I'd say so many of us who say we're Christian need to be engaging the outcast of society the way that Jesus always did through the Gospels.
And we will come back to that because you were right on. You're A+. A+.
I have a question, though. If an outcast, how have you been successful then in recruiting others to join the...
John's going to answer you.
I guess I was directing. Go ahead.
Watch out, Mike. Watch out, Mike. It's a brother-sister thing happening here. Siblings. Go ahead, John.
That's what's so
Tell the
amazing
judge.
about the story. Is it'd be one thing if she was the head of the entire state that came back and said, hey, I just saw the real deal. We got to change our ways. She was an outcast of society and was able to come back and show them the way.
And she was an outcast in an outcast society. I mean, we don't know what they thought of her. We don't know. But for some reason, and we don't know why she came alone. That could be the outcast thing. We don't know. But for some reason, her presentation was so powerful to them that they just couldn't resist. And to think, they not only asked Jesus, but the apostles came. He didn't go alone back to that town for 2 days. They moved in a group.
I'm a humble of gray matter, but some people say that she came at that time of day because less people be at the well, because of her situation, because it was the heat of the day.
Say that again, Rob.
She came out in the heat of the day,
Right.
which less people would come out.
Yes.
The well. I've heard that. I'm not accurate, but I'm just sharing that. I always find it interesting. He was already there. He was waiting for her. And she came. And then he engaged her if she was willing. As we know how the story unfolds, I just think that's phenomenal. He was there waiting to engage. And he wanted to be present, and she picked up on it.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot about my own prayer, the Lord is always present, just waiting. How am I going to engage myself and respond to whatever? I think it's a great story. We got these great readings during our Lenten season. I think it brings me warmth and comfort to just think, God, he loved her so much and just wanted to be present to bring to her in her own loneliness of pain. Obviously, he knew her story, so he let it unfold. He says, I want to bring some understanding to you, some hope and grace. And she was like, okay. And I think, too, I thought it was profound in the scripture. She said that I know there will be a Messiah. I mean, she had an understanding about everything that was going on, said that, and then to have him say to her, I am he.
Stunning.
Oh my God. Talk about an encounter. What a gift. And how many times is that in front of us as well? Presence. The Messiah is here. I am he. And where do we in our own lives say, I know that, and welcome it?
Yeah.
Anyways.
Thank you. Just reach the microphone over to Bob. Thanks, Rob.
You mentioned, I think it was last week, and you started off by saying, remember that Jesus was a faithful Jew. And another whole dimension of this story, I'm not sure that I'm exactly convinced that she was an outcast, but I am convinced that she was on the margins of something. Because she may have put herself there, or she may have been put there by society. We could only guess.
Yep.
But she was, because she came at noon, lots of good scholarship suggests that she was not in the mainstream. But then I shift to your comment about the disciples that were with him. And when they figured out, not only is he's having this conversation with her, you mean we're really going there? And we're going to stay there 2 more days? At that point, if not before, they knew that they were now on the margins because they could never go back to the traditional Jewish life because now they would be marginalized because of that encounter and plenty of others like that. So for disciples, it was sort of a point of no return. Not the only one, but a point of no return. And I think that for many Christians, sometimes there is that moment when we realize we're sort of standing in 2 countries, but then there becomes a point of no return when you have to make a commitment one way or the other.
Right. Thank you. And as we, Kathy, did you want to say something, honey?
I can wait.
Oh,
I want to listen to you.
oh. The thing that just occurred to me as I heard Rob and Bob speaking is that both of them were outsiders. He in foreign territory, and she, coming at noon, says something. And that's an important lesson for all of us because in some areas we are outsiders. In some situations. It's fascinating. Well, let's just, Kathy.
I do just want to say that in this, I love the part of this story that I love that she recognized when Jesus said, I am, and she recognized that he was. And I often, because I've sat with this gospel before, wondered all the things that she must have been feeling from oh dear to great, and then excited, and then frightened, and then to be able to go forward with all of that emotion and share. I love that she saw and believed.
Yeah.
And preached. And preached.
Well, you know, when he said, the one with whom you have been speaking, I am he, don't you remember the first time somebody said to you, I really love you? Or the job is yours? Or I have found a parish. There are those moments when things change for us, and they certainly changed for her. So that's, you're wonderful. Gosh. Then that leads us then to the text. John puts her in the 4th chapter because John is laying out, we're at the book now, John is laying out for his community what he thinks they need. And he's doing it symbolically, very different from the other 3. So he starts with the wedding feast of Cana, Jewish wedding, Jewish community, his mother Jewish, everybody's there. And John puts that in his gospel as an example of a rich Jewish community. Then he goes on to say, during the night, Nicodemus, a Pharisee, came to him to ask questions. There's a breach in the wall. He's showing it. Then he comes to the Samaritan woman. There's a bigger breach in the wall. And then next week, he heals a blind man, and the religious leaders are out of their minds, and they call in the parents and put them right in the middle, because if they said it was Jesus that did it, they'd get expelled from the synagogue. So they said, talk to the blind man. He is building a case that the Christian message is much broader than the original believers thought. It's called the Book of Signs. So now for you and me, how does this gospel play out today? Corporately, institutionally, church-wise, politically, in our families. How does this gospel play out today? Sit with that for a minute. I used to say in class, don't everybody put up their hand at once. I won't know who to call on. It has occurred to me more than ever that she's nameless. She is identified by where she came from. She is given Samaritan as a name. I find today we take a name, Jew, and use it to justify abuse. I was little when World War II ended. I know you think it was World War I, but it wasn't. And I remember Life magazine coming into our home and the pictures from the camps. And how that still remains, that Jew is a way to abuse others. And what we forget is that Muslims and Christians all have Jewish roots, just like the Samaritans had Jewish roots. From early on, using Mary Magdalene as an example, to the present day, our beloved church has been unjust to other women, considering them outsiders. Who are the outsiders of our faith today that we are called to engage and embrace? Who are they? Kathy.
Well, I'm just
Oh, Rob,
gonna
I'm sorry.
say the outsiders are faith, but they might be within or faith but feel that they're outsiders. I think you just mentioned earlier issues about women in the church. I think, our gay, lesbian, transgender, all these other individuals that today or before us, that we need to be present to and reflect upon. I think, too, people struggle in welcoming migrants and the refugees in the church. I think that's a very important moment in our lives, certainly. What else? I probably could go on. It's ever before my daily prayer to think about and pray for people who don't feel they're part of what I love about my faith. It's not perfect, but what I love about it, I want them to feel, at least in my prayer, in my presence, they're welcomed, and I'll do everything to include them and have them beside me as sister and brother.
Well, you do that. You've always done that. That's a gift you have, and it's what makes us so pleased that we have you as pastor and brother. Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I would add to that list. Thank you. Seems silly for 3 words, but. I would just add to that list those who struggle with mental health issues and addiction. I see that all through the Bible. All through the Bible, Jesus takes the time and makes the time for those who are, as Teresa of Avila would call it, possessed, right? And I think we still struggle mightily with that today. If someone doesn't act the way we expect sitting in the pews, we wonder what the heck they're doing there.
Yeah. Anybody else before I go on to another? Yes, Bob.
I'm connecting the dots about points you made before about Samaritans and Jews had similar heritage, Christians, Catholics, and Protestants, and the split. And I think that one of the reasons why those splits become so painful and ultimately so violent is because when someone takes a different road, it's easy to feel that as a rejection instead of just a different road. So I would view this as anyone who takes a different road is not a threat to me on my road, but we have not been brought up that way. Mm-hmm. We are been brought up to see that someone who takes a different road is somehow a threat to me. Yeah. And I think that that's a fundamental flaw that goes back not just to our modern culture, but obviously goes back as far as anyone can remember.
Cain and Abel. Mm-hmm. Cain and Abel. Bob, my experience since the 80s, when I was 12, I had the privilege of preaching in over a dozen Protestant Christian churches. It was to raise money for the jail, but I never expected what I found. And I found such faith and such commitment that it was so revealing to me and such a moment of growth that we don't have all the answers. And people of good faith have found where they can worship. That was wonderful for me. And yet there is a push today by some, and National Catholic Reporter had a recent article moving against Pope Francis, particularly on his 10th anniversary, about those we would call Samaritans today. His comments about LGBTQ people, his comments about gay marriage, his comments about the divorced. But I think this is what the gospel is asking us to do, as Rob said, to go take that message, go deeply into it, and try to live it out today. In other words, she went back to her townspeople. What do our families think about us, our townspeople, our work people? It's so important for us to name who are the Samaritans in my life, and Lori has labeled quite a few, Rob has labeled quite a few, and Bob. Who are the Samaritans in my life? But there's one part of the story that for many years I never thought about. She left her water jar. She left it and went back enthusiastically to her town. Maybe it was her source of income. We don't know. Maybe she had to go because she was sort of outcast herself at that time of day, but she left it behind. And so I have to ask myself, and this is hard, what am I willing to leave behind in the pursuit of the gospel message? What are the water jars that we cling to today? And I want to read one thing to you and then open up the discussion even more. Sandra Schneiders is a great author, and the book is Written That You May Believe. And on page 41, she writes about the Samaritan woman, and she says, in summary, the entire dialogue between Jesus and the woman is a wooing of Samaria to full covenant fidelity in the new Israel by Jesus, the new bridegroom. It has nothing to do with the woman's private moral life, but with the covenant life of the community. Nowhere else in the fourth gospel is there a dialogue of such theological depth and intensity. Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus in chapter 3 ends a long theological monologue by Jesus. At the Last Supper, Jesus gives lengthy theological discourses, but in this extraordinary scene, the woman is not simply a foil feeding Jesus' cue lines. She's a genuine theological dialogue partner, gradually experience Jesus' self-revelation as she reveals herself to him. That's a powerful statement about her. So, what else might we gather from this gospel? What do you think, Bob, Pippin? You're thinking. Do you want to say something, Bob? Okay. Jim does. Jim Cleveland. You go for it, Jim.
I think basically you have answered a lot of questions that I didn't even know I had. And
you're in my will. $3.
yeah, and as I've always said before, many times, that this is like a PhD level of training, of course, of understanding. I understand so much more, actually, though, that makes me sometimes have even more questions.
Yeah.
It's wonderful.
Yeah. Having more questions, yeah. That's why we make such an error if we take the words absolutely literally and don't put the bookmark of their context and culture in one place. And if we take it so literally, how can we apply it to our own context and our own culture? But we never had that coming up. We didn't even have Bibles in our house. You probably did, but we didn't, and we couldn't read it. Is that not so? It is absolutely. It's on the shelf, and isn't it pretty? Mike Wolford.
Yes. What I found so many insights that you've provided us here, and I really never appreciated it. I've listened to that gospel over the years, a lot longer years than others around here, because I'm older. But it seems as though this is an example of Christ waiting for someone at that well who he wanted to, in a sense, act as his ambassador to the town. And it's clear that was his intention. I think he wouldn't have stayed there 2 days if it wasn't something he had thought about. It's interesting, he chose her. Maybe there was no one else around. But he really, this was the beginning, I guess you might say, of his evangelization of the community, of outsiders, of the Samaritans who were not obviously Jewish. They were not part of his following. And that was the beginning, really, when you think about it, of the church.
Isn't it, you made me think of this. I wonder, this is just a thought, I wonder if Jesus, when he said way back in Luke 4, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to bring good news to the poor, and so forth, did he ever sense that it would go beyond the Jewish community?
Yeah.
That's a question. Did he ever sense it? But obviously, John says yes. But John is writing 60 years after the resurrection. He's talking about a situation that has already taken place. But think if we didn't welcome the Gentiles, you and I wouldn't be sitting here.
Right.
But it is an amazing story of her intelligence and his openness. Mike.
Yes.
Oh, I thought you wanted to say something else.
No. I was also, of course, mystified by the fact that since the disciples now were not standing there hearing this conversation, how did they pick it up? Where did they get it from? Christ? Did Christ say, this is what I said to her and this is what she said to me?
Or the townspeople told them, you never know.
Yeah, it was picked up.
Yeah.
So, interesting.
John, did you want to say something?
I
It's a
think
family
that-
here.
I
This
think
is the
last
Wolford.
words that those powerful "I am He" is there. Those words are so powerful, and I reflect on he had so many opportunities to reveal that he was the Messiah and did not. Opportunities to get out of death. Opportunities in the Jewish state to reveal who he was, to then get all the accolades and all the power. And who did he identify who he was to? A foreigner at a well at noon, and who he would get nothing out of it. The humility and humbleness of that, I think, is powerful.
Thank you. Wow. There we go. So, Donna. Oh, Donna Eckert, I've known forever. Tell us what you think, Donna.
Forever is a long,
Time's
long
up.
time.
No, just kidding. What, Donna?
I'm fascinated by your opening remarks about John's Gospel being written in the 90s, which I knew, and I understood that it's much more theological than the others. But the fact that there were more Gentiles than Jews at that point. And so I'm fascinated by the remark that Jesus makes to this about Jews being the salvation. And his making that statement and comparing it to my own upbringing in the Roman Rite, where I was taught in school that the only people that would get salvation were the Catholics.
Right.
The only people going to heaven were the Catholics. And even in like the 3rd grade, I can remember being so sad about that because my little friend Patty across the street was Presbyterian. Which meant that when we went to heaven, I would be there, but she would not. In comparison, this week I had lunch with my great Jewish friend, doctor, that I worked with for years. And we always have theological, religious discussions when we have lunch. And I asked him, I said, so tell me, Saul, how are you feeling now with the climate that we're living with in our nation? Are you afraid? Are you brokenhearted? So we talked a little bit about that and his fear of not being safe, of going to temple and worrying that something might happen. And he said, we do have guards at the temple now. He said, but I guess if something's going to happen, it's going to happen. And I sat at lunch with him, and I felt so sad. So sad that this is the place that we're at, where there are those among us who feel, as outsiders, are feeling so unsafe. And I asked myself when I left lunch, and what is my responsibility in all of this?
It seems to me that one of our big responsibilities is to at least be aware that it's going on. To be aware, because we sort of think that'll never happen. But there is something within our human nature that when some group gains power, we feel threatened. And I think it's a scarcity model. Well, if Pam gets something, that's less for me. Yep, you got it all. You don't leave her. We'll have a terrible time with her. But there's a scarcity model, and I think many, with all the white dear men I love here, I think there are many white men in our community and world who feel threatened.
Amen.
The scarcity model, if those women take over, and I don't want us to take over, I want us to partner. If we take over, we could do stupid stuff. But if the blacks take over, and if the migrants take over, and if the Muslims grow, they're threatened. But Jesus didn't seem at all threatened. Went into town, had a nice lunch, slept 2 nights, and it must have changed him as well.
Do you know why?
Why, dear?
Because he knew.
He's got it.
I got it.
Yeah.
Mike's back there.
Mike's.
My.
Good line.
He's always someplace, Mike. Jesus knew that we were all his brothers and sisters. He knew that God is living through his people. We are sons and daughters and brothers and sisters of the Christ. So Jesus knew that. So that's a tremendous freeing state of mind to be in, knowing that is being true. Over 2,000 years, we have continued to create our own tribes, whether they be Jewish, Muslim, LBG, whatever the initials are, right? We continue to create more tribes and being tribal. Now, we can say that's human, but I don't think that's the Christian philosophy that Jesus came to tell us about, okay? And I think I have a lot of faith in humanity that eventually we will get there, that we will come to the realization that we are all children of the Creator. We are all brothers and sisters, and nothing's going to change until that message is drilled into our heads. We had too many other messages delivered to us over the years, which don't follow that thought process at all. And my hope is in that for the future of Christianity and for the future of the world, really.
It's a call to a broader vision.
Oh, yeah.
And one final thought I have, because I hear the sound saying, "Stop, Barb." One final thought I have is, I hadn't realized this before. See, Scripture changes your mind. Jesus meets the woman. He knows she's a resident. He knows she's a Samaritan. He knows, he can tell. And yet he engages, and yet he's willing to go to their town. I wonder if sometimes he said, boy, I hope I'm making the right decision here, because I could be in trouble. And he was. And he was eventually. Yeah. Well, you are so kind to come. To all the friends who are online, thank you. Rob, thank you for your hospitality.
Put in mind next week, we're taking a pause because we have a funeral here Saturday morning.
And we'll be back with Lazarus. I have a good joke to tell you. Okay. Jesus said, Lazarus, come forth, and he brought a fifth. And happy St. Patrick's Day to everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you so much. He brought a fifth.
Oh, yeah, she did. Oh, yeah, she did.
I did what?
Who wrote that one for you?
A long time ago, I read it somewhere.